For centuries, Rome ruled the Western world. Its cities were safe and busy. Its roads ran for thousands of miles. And ordinary people lived with a comfort and order the world wouldn't see again for 1,000 years. But that world didn't end in a single day, or a single battle. For ordinary people, the fall of Rome was something slower and stranger. The quiet unraveling of everything that had kept them safe. Money became worthless, cities emptied, the roads grew dangerous, and new peoples settled on Roman land. Until one day, the greatest empire the West had ever known simply faded away. This is what it was like to live through the fall of Rome.
To see how much was lost, we have to start at the height. At its peak, the Roman Empire stretched around the entire Mediterranean, and for ordinary people inside it, life was remarkably stable. A person could travel from one end of the empire to the other in relative safety, using the same money, speaking a common language, protected by the same laws. For the ancient world, that was extraordinary. Roman roads, tens of thousands of miles of them, connected the whole empire. Goods, letters, and people flowed along them, bringing grain, wine, and oil from distant provinces to ordinary local markets. Even ordinary towns had things that seem almost modern: public baths, running water carried in on aqueducts, paved streets, markets, and theaters. Daily life had a comfort that wouldn't return for centuries. The public baths were the heart of daily life. People went not just to wash, but to meet friends, talk business, and relax. For a few coins, even a poor person could enjoy a comfort fit for a king. For a craftsman, a shopkeeper, or a farmer, life was hard but predictable. There was order. There was a state that kept the peace, defended the borders, and kept the roads and markets running. Far away, on distant frontiers, the legions held the borders. Most ordinary people never saw a battle. The fighting happened on the edges, while life in the heart of the empire stayed calm. This was the world ordinary Romans were born into, one that felt permanent, eternal. They even called their capital the Eternal City. It seemed impossible that any of it could ever end. But it could. And slowly it began to. The change was so gradual that, at first, most people barely noticed. It started not with an invasion, but with something far quieter: money. For a long time, the empire ran on a trusted silver coin. Ordinary people used it every day, and it held its value. As long as the money was sound, trade and daily life simply worked. But the empire grew expensive to run and unstable to rule. Wars on the borders and endless struggles for the throne drained the treasury. The emperors needed far more money than they had. So they did something that seemed clever and was quietly disastrous. They made the coins with less and less silver, mixing in cheaper metal, while pretending each coin was still worth the same. People weren't fooled for long. As the coins became worth less, prices shot up again and again. The savings of ordinary families slowly turned into almost nothing. At its worst, the money lost value so fast that people needed sacks of coins just to buy basic things. Some gave up on money altogether and went back to simply trading goods for goods. And the money was only one symptom. In the 3rd century, the empire nearly tore itself apart. In about 50 years, it ran through dozens of emperors, most of them murdered or killed in battle. Roman armies fought each other for the throne instead of guarding the borders. While they did, enemies pushed in from outside, and provinces were raided that hadn't seen war in generations. On top of the wars came disease. A series of devastating plagues swept through the crowded cities, killing huge numbers of people and emptying entire streets. The population began to fall. To pay for the wars and the armies, the state demanded more and more in taxes. For ordinary farmers and craftsmen, the tax collector became a figure of genuine dread. Taxes grew so heavy that some farmers could barely keep enough to live on. A single bad harvest could mean ruin. Working hard no longer guaranteed you could even feed your own family. Some people abandoned their land and fled just to escape the taxes. So the state did something drastic. It passed laws to freeze people in place. Farmers were legally bound to the land, forbidden to leave. And it didn't stop with farmers. More and more jobs became hereditary by law. The son of a baker had to be a baker. The son of a soldier. People were locked into the lives they were born into. For protection from the taxes and the chaos, many poor farmers gave up their freedom to powerful local landowners. In return for working their land and obeying them, they got a measure of safety. Slowly, ordinary people stopped looking to the distant emperor for protection and started looking to the powerful man who owned the land nearby. This quiet shift would one day become the medieval world. The gap between rich and poor grew vast. A small number of great landowners lived in enormous luxury, while ordinary people sank deeper into poverty and dependence. The middle was being squeezed out. In the cities, life was getting harder too. With trade shrinking and money unstable, goods grew scarce and expensive. The crowded, thriving towns of the past slowly grew quieter. People began to leave the cities. Some fled the taxes, some the danger. Some simply followed the work out to the countryside. Houses stood empty. Neighborhoods that once buzzed fell silent. The great public buildings began to decay. Without enough people or money to maintain them, baths, theaters, and fountains fell into disrepair. The comforts of Roman life were quietly disappearing. Even the aqueducts, the marvels that carried fresh water into the towns, began to fail. When they broke, there was no longer the wealth or the skill to fully repair them. Towns lost their running water. People started tearing down old Roman buildings for their stone, using the ruins of a grander past to build smaller, humbler things. The empire was, in a sense, being slowly resold. As the state weakened, it could no longer keep the roads safe. The same roads that had carried trade and travelers in safety now became dangerous, haunted by bandits. Travel became risky. A merchant carrying goods or a family moving between towns could no longer count on getting there safely. Long-distance trade, the lifeblood of the empire, began to wither. As trade broke down, goods from distant provinces stopped arriving. Markets that once sold wares from across the Mediterranean now offered only what could be made nearby. The whole world was shrinking. People had to make do with what they could produce themselves. Villages turned inward, growing their own food and making their own goods. The wide, connected Roman world was breaking into small local pieces. As life grew poorer and more local, other things faded too. Fewer people learned to read and write. The learning that cities had once supported began to slip away, surviving only in a few quiet places. None of this happened all at once. A person might live their whole life and only notice that things were a little harder than in their parents' day. But over generations, the decline added up. And then it sped up. Because beyond the borders, the world was moving. Pushed by war and hunger far to the east, whole peoples were on the move, looking for safer land. And the land they wanted was inside the empire. At first, many came not as invaders, but as refugees, begging to be let in. In one famous moment, a huge group fleeing a fearsome enemy was allowed to cross the border onto Roman land. But they were treated badly, cheated, starved, and abused by Roman officials. Pushed too far, they rose up. and the empire discovered it could no longer easily control the peoples it had let inside. To defend itself, the empire increasingly hired these very peoples to fight in its armies. More and more Roman soldiers were not Roman at all, but warriors from beyond the old borders. Whole groups were given land inside the empire in exchange for military service. For ordinary Romans, this meant new neighbors with different languages and customs, settling on what had always been Roman soil. In some places it meant raids and fear, villagers hiding their grain, families fleeing to the hills when warriors passed through. The safety ordinary people had always known was simply gone. But in many places, the change was less a sudden conquest and more a slow blending. Romans and newcomers lived side by side, intermarried, and shared the land. The line between Roman and barbarian began to blur. And in more and more regions, real power slipped from distant Roman officials to local strongmen, often the leaders of these new peoples. They collected the taxes now. They kept the order now. And then came a moment that shook the entire ancient world. For the first time in nearly 800 years, an enemy army reached the walls of Rome itself and broke in. For 3 days, the city was looted. Compared to later horrors, it was almost restrained. But that hardly mattered. The unthinkable had happened. The eternal city had fallen. News of it spread across the empire and beyond, and people were stunned. If Rome could fall, then nothing was safe. To many it felt as if the world itself was coming to an end. And yet for most ordinary people, far from the city, daily life didn't suddenly change. The sun rose, the fields still needed working, the taxes still came. The collapse was real, but it was slow. Across the West, one province after another slipped out of Roman control, becoming the kingdom of one people or another. The map of the empire was quietly dissolving, piece by piece. By now, the emperors in the West were almost powerless, controlled by their own generals. The very last of them was just a teenage boy, placed on the throne as little more than a figurehead. In the year 476, a Germanic commander in Italy decided he no longer needed a Roman emperor at all. He simply removed the boy from the throne, and didn't even bother to replace him. And that was it. No great final battle, no dramatic last stand. The Western Roman Empire didn't fall with a crash. It simply ended, quietly, when one man decided it no longer needed to exist. For ordinary people, almost nothing changed that day. They woke up in the same villages under the same skies. Most of them probably never even heard that the empire they were born in had officially ended. The land was now ruled by Germanic kings instead of Roman emperors. But these new rulers often kept Roman officials, Roman laws, and the Latin language. On the surface, much still looked the same. The fall of Rome wasn't a single event, but a long fading. The empire didn't so much die as slowly dissolve into something new, a patchwork of kingdoms built on the bones of the Roman world. Over the generations that followed, the world the Romans had known kept shrinking. Towns grew smaller. The great stone cities became villages, clustered among the ruins of something far grander. People lived among the remains of the empire. Broken aqueducts, crumbling temples, overgrown roads, often with little idea who had built them. The ruins towered over a poorer, simpler life. Much of the old skill was simply lost. For centuries afterward, no one in the West could build roads, baths, or aqueducts the way the Romans had. The knowledge had faded with the world that used it. As the old state vanished, one institution quietly grew into the gap it left: the church. Its bishops and monasteries took over charity, learning, and record-keeping, becoming the thread that survived. And the pattern from the empire's last days hardened into a new way of life. Ordinary people worked the land of a local lord who offered protection in return. This bond would shape Europe for the next 1,000 years. For centuries, people would look back on Rome as a lost golden age, a time of wonders they could see in the ruins around them but could no longer build. The memory of it haunted the whole Middle Ages. The world that emerged was the early Middle Ages, poorer, more dangerous, and far more local than the empire that came before. The light of Rome hadn't been switched off. It had slowly dimmed. So how did Rome fall? Not in a day, and not in a single battle. It fell the way a great house falls when no one can keep it up anymore, slowly, room by room, until one day the whole thing is a ruin. For ordinary people, the fall of Rome wasn't a dramatic ending. It was the slow loss of everything that had made their world safe and comfortable: the money, the roads, the cities, the order. Most of them never knew they were living through the fall of an empire. They were just trying to feed their families and stay safe, as the great world they were born into quietly came apart around them. And maybe that's the most haunting part. The greatest empire the Western world had ever seen didn't end in fire and thunder. It faded, so slowly that the people living through it barely felt it go. A reminder that even the mightiest things don't always fall in a single blow. Sometimes they just wear away, quietly, one ordinary day at a time, until all that's left is ruins, and the people living among them